It's summer. So we're still in Isaiah chapter 3, and kind of the last section of it. If you've got the handout, it should say page 5 at the bottom. And we are at question 11, so far as I understand. We had talked a lot about the poor and the homeless last time. Just to clarify some remarks I had made, when I said, sometimes people talk about making laws or not making laws that would make homelessness illegal, and I think I said something to the effect, we could have a debate or a discussion about that, and obviously, a person it's out of their control if they become homeless, right? Usually, so just to be homeless in this itself is not criminal or it's not a moral thing as such. And within that population, you've got some people who, given a hand up, they'll get out of it and on their way. It's a temporary stop. And then you've got some people maybe who are mentally ill, and you got other people who are stuck in substance abuse, and other people it may be issues in the family and just all kinds of things. So there's no one size fits all diagnosis of what got them into it, nor solution for those who are in it either. And I suppose what people mean by that is a little bit more where the discussion would take place. Obviously, it doesn't help them or anybody else if they are allowed to destroy businesses and destroy property as they try to cope with their situation. And so that there would be laws that would prevent loitering. Loitering laws have been around for practically forever. That would, we could have a discussion about that a little bit, how that should be enforced, and does society really want to put a person in a jail over that? Do you want to pay for that way, or you can fine them, but what are they going to pay you with? But that at least there would be a law that would allow the police to remove them to another location or something like that. But these are all complex issues, and you might have as many opinions about what to do about it as you have people in a room, and then none of them may even have the right solution, and in some cases there is no solution, right? Some of these situations are so complex that there's not necessarily any great solutions, but that's kind of what I meant in terms of having a discussion about it. Could be applied to some other things we face in life as well. So we had that was in reference to verses 13 to 15, and the idea that in Israel's time, in Judah's time, while Isaiah is prophesying, you had people who were taking advantage of the fact that the poor have no recourse to legal help. They don't have influential people to defend them. And that not only people kind of let them be in their situation very often with no compassion, but that those in power, and by power I don't mean government authority, those who had position in society and money and that kind of thing, would often take advantage of them. And that's always been the case. This isn't unique to Judah and Jerusalem. Jesus took the Pharisees of his day to task over the fact that they robbed widows of their houses, right? That she defaults on the mortgage or whatever, and they just move in and take over and put her out. And then for a show, they made lengthy prayers. Anyway, we could go into all kinds of economic discussions and societal discussions about that, but it is something the prophets took Israel to task about. So we get to the last section of the chapter, verses 16 to 23 of Isaiah chapter 3, and that's where we're picking it up here today. So 16 to 23. The Lord says, "The women of Zion are haughty, walking along with outstretched necks, flirting with their eyes, tripping along with mincing steps, with ornaments jingling on their ankles. Therefore the Lord will bring sores on the heads of the women of Zion. The Lord will make their scalps bald. In that day the Lord will snatch away their finery, the bangles and headbands and crescent necklaces, the earrings and bracelets and veils, the headdresses and ankle chains and sashes, perfume bottles and charms, the signet rings and nose rings, the fine robes and the capes and the cloaks, the purses and the mirrors and the linen garments and tiaras and shawls. So he's going to the walk-in closet and he's stripping it out, right? Gonna get all that, and then he's going to the bathroom vanity and he's getting rid of all that stuff too. And then at the end he takes the jewelry box and throws that in the trash. Instead of fragrance, there will be a stench. Instead of a sash, a rope. Instead of well-dressed hair, baldness. Instead of fine clothing, sackcloth. Instead of beauty, branding. Your men will fall by the sword, your warriors in battle. The gates of Zion will lament and mourn. Destitute, she will sit on the ground. In that day, 7 women will take hold of one man and say, we will eat our own food and provide our own clothes. Only let us be called by your name. Take away our disgrace. All right. So sometimes people say, well, how come in the Bible? In fact, so, with the whole gender language thing today, and there's a different feel about that generationally. And even, I'm not talking about the transgender thing, but just, how do you refer to a group of people? Well, do you refer to the indefinite, someone or anyone? Do you say he or they? Or should the word man or men refer to humankind in general, or only to the male gender, right? And so there has been some change along those lines. And professor, one of our schools at the college where you've got mixed people, actually had a student in class. He claimed to say to him, "How come God is always mad at the men?"
They're the leaders. They have all the money. They have all the weapons.
Well, okay, they're the ones
that can beat people up. Women don't beat people up so much.
As much, yeah. So they have the position in society like that. But part of it was also a misunderstanding. No, that's good. Part of it was a misunderstanding of the fact that the word man, historically, like when Neil Armstrong jumps down on the moon, right? One small step for a man, one giant step for man. Mankind is not a reference to males, right? And very often the word man was used in a generic sense, and the person was just wondering why God, why God was always it's dealing with people in general. But as Robert here kind of indicates, a lot of times it is the fact that God is identifying the men as the leaders and the representative of the family and society in particular. So the buck kind of stops there, and that's who God takes to task.
I mean, there's always the Cleopatras and the...
Well, you've got...
there have been...
We talked last time, you had Athaliah, right, bad queen in Israel's history. You also had Esther, good queen, but they were exceptional. They weren't the norm.
Right,
they aren't...
I'm not saying that Maggie Thatcher was an evil leader or anything like that. Maybe she was okay,
But in the long history, even of a modern country, that's the exception, not the rule.
That's right.
Yeah. So there is that, but so based on what I just read here, Isaiah's bringing a little balance to the equation, if you will. And in most of the book, he's talking about the problems with the men. We had all those leaders he talked about early in the chapter that God was going to take out of Israel. And almost in every case, you're talking about male leadership. But here he is directing things at the ladies of society as well and their interests. So verse 11, distinguish between the root sin and its symptoms. So what are the symptoms, he says, of their sin, and what I just read to you, would appear. But what's the real root of it?
I'd say idolatry. They love their jewelry and everything.
Okay. So interesting that you identify that as idolatry. It is a form of idolatry. In the Catechism, it's what we refer to as secret idolatry, because they're not going to a pagan temple for all of that, right? That just living their lives. But the almighty dollar, or the almighty shekel, in their case, the wealth, the jewelry has become a false god to them. So it's the materialism that he's kind of listing off, and just the shallowness of raising things like fashion to such a high level. We'll get to another question about that in just a moment. But okay, so the idolatry of that, and where does it come from? He identifies right at the beginning of the verse where he says the women have become haughty. That there's arrogance, that they think so highly of themselves and they think they're better than other people. And that then flows down into the way that they handle the material possessions. And it's all about the image, and it's all about how one looks. And what's on the inside becomes less of a concern. So is God condemning jewelry, makeup, hairdressers, nice clothing, fashionable clothing?
Depends on how you're using it.
Okay. The issue, so you have a similar passage, not really similar, somewhat parallel passage in Peter's letter where he talks about how a woman's beauty shouldn't come from braided hair and her clothing and jewelry and that kind of thing, but it ought to come from a quiet and gentle spirit that pleases God. And that has sometimes been used as a cudgel in some churches to say that it is an outright sin for a woman to try to enhance her beauty with things like makeup, with things like jewelry, with things like the way she dresses, with things like hairstyle. There's a story I know from my wife's side of the family that they grew up in a somewhat old fundamentalist American sect, Grandpa and Grandma Stevenson, and were active in it. And her aunts were raised in it. But her aunts, when they were girls still, had discovered makeup. And I guess Tommy and Esma must have tolerated that at home and for them going out in public, but they decided that Mom needed to put some on too before church one Sunday. And she got called Jezebel at church because she wore makeup on Sunday morning. It didn't go over well with everybody. And passages like Peter, or perhaps here in Isaiah, have sometimes been used as an excuse for it. But the issue is not the outward adornment. He is not saying that it was wrong to have those things or wear those things. He does talk about the inner attitude as the heart of the matter. It's not a sin to make yourself look as good as you can. Note how the punishment fits the crime, verse 24. So you notice kind of the parallels? So they're going to put on perfume, but in place of perfume, you're going to have...
open sores and stuff that smell bad.
Okay, a stench, right? And instead of the fancy hair, you're going to have baldness. And instead of a sash, fashion accessory, a rope, you'll be tied up as slaves. So he kind of matches these things up with what's going to come when he's not specifically speaking to it just yet, but he's really looking ahead to that time when the Babylonians are going to come along. And Judah is going to lose their freedom because of their sins. And it's not just the men that's going to affect. It's going to affect the whole family, ladies as well. And these are the specific applications God sends the prophet to make in their regard. 13, so at the very end here, 325 to 4:1. What do those verses reveal about Judah's casualties in the upcoming battles that they will face as judgment? Do you have the verse? I'll read it again to you here. Your men will fall by the sword, your warriors in battle, the gates of Zion will lament and mourn. Destitute shall sit on the ground. In that day 7 women will take hold of one man and say, we will eat our own food and provide our own clothes. Only let us be called by your name. Take away our disgrace. What's Isaiah suggesting? He doesn't say it just outright, but what's that suggesting? It has at times been a problem for other societies where you've had a war.
In the Soviet Union, which some people criticize their leaders for not for not respecting the lives of their men, there was such a huge number of deaths that, I mean, being married was, I mean, there were lots of women that had to move into other professions that were male, like physicians and stuff, because there just weren't anybody alive.
Nobody left.
Nobody left.
Yeah. They suffered. So they seem to be
10 million or something.
Their generals seem to be fine with the concept of a war of attrition. Right? We are going to overwhelm you with our population and kill as many as you need. We're just going to be. The hordes of us is just going to overrun you. And whereas I think the Americans lost about 600,000 in World War II, if I'm not mistaken, it was multiple millions of the Russians for the same cause. And they threw bodies at it.
We benefited from that. I mean,
right.
Yeah, I mean, they won the war basically. We just gave them guns and
Nazi Germany had no choice but to throw a big part of their military with that kind of being overrun. They had no choice but to throw their own men against that.
But people have said that they had lousy leaders. Okay, shut up.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you win by strategy, and then sometimes you just win by overwhelming, right? That you just have the superior might, and if you don't have the superior might in weapons, and if you got the superior might in numbers, it's just a numbers game. You can kill us 10-1, but we still got so many more that you're not getting ahead. The point is that for society, when 7 women are willing to take hold of one man and say, you don't even have to really live with us as wife. Just give us your name, and we'll take care of otherwise supporting ourselves. But the fact that so many of the men were going to disappear from the society, so it's on both sides that the judgment comes down. I'm going to skip 14 for now, and 15 and go on. This gets into the Leverett Law. Questions for today. Backside. We live in a nation which greatly values personal liberty and individual freedom. How important do you consider strong leadership for the welfare of a nation? So that was kind of an early consideration in the chapter. Is strong leadership on a governmental level enough? Is it the most important thing? Do you see evidence we've experienced a similar judgment of God in our nation in the past decades? And if so, what's the solution? So. As we were going through the text, we had an opportunity to talk about the effects that taking all this leadership out of society would have. We also pointed out that some of those positions, many of those positions were government, but not all of them. It really hit just about all the structures of society. So in addition to the people who were advising the king, you were taking out people who led the military. You were taking out the prophet. So what we would say, the church life, that leadership goes. You were taking out some of the people who would have been more business and industry.
The whole generation.
Yeah.
It sounds like it. It sounds like it was a whole generation.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you were lucky to survive that, then you would consider yourself, maybe think of yourself as lucky, but.
So is the American idea to have a strong government or a weak one?
Both. Yes and no.
Okay, explain.
That's pretentious.
Well,
Strong enough so that if somebody decides to invade at midnight, a minute after midnight, then they'll have leaders that will tell them to go knock off the invasion and stuff like that. Weak enough so that local areas and states can have their own choices and make some choices locally.
Okay.
And also, I mean, people have often remarked that democracies are they're flimsy. They're like Hitler thought that the Soviet Union, you just kick them and they fall over and things. So it's unstable. You need a Bismarck. Okay, I'm being tacky, Okay. Yeah, but it's both. It's both. I mean, it's weird.
So from the foundation, what was one of the things that they put in that seemed to almost kind of weaken the government?
Rights, Bill of Rights, 10 amendments.
Well, okay, so you got the constitutional republic and the fact that the people are protected in these certain ways. How about the way that just the government was set up? I mean, so, we've lived in it, it's 250 years now, right? Just about 250 years next year. Well, not quite. I guess the Constitution doesn't come along until what?
87.
87? But,
Individual liberties.
well, so a big emphasis on individual liberty. And in order to try to make sure that nobody gets too much power, you've got the three branches of government. Historically, that's an oddity. Yeah, you had a little bit of that in Roman times, where you had some division. And of course, they didn't invent this just whole cloth. They had looked back at some things that seemed to work for a long time. Okay, if you wanted to find a government that seemed to last a long time, Rome was not a bad place to look. It lasted for almost 1,000 years in some fashion or another, constantly moving and changing, but still. But the idea, you had your judicial branch, right? You had your executive branch, you had your legislative branch, and they were checks and balances against each other so that nobody got too high. And to this day, when one of the other branch seems to be overstepping its bounds a little bit, everybody else gets a little bit uneasy about that kind of thing. But there's always been this kind of idea of limited government, right? Because we recognize that just as individual humans become corrupt, and just as corporations become corrupt, and just as the church can become corrupt, so also governments can become corrupt. Where you ever have power of any sort, corruption eventually seems to come along. So that if you have kind of divided things out and thinned it out so that nobody gets too much of it, you're trying to kind of keep that under taps a little bit. And I think that's always been a part of the psyche in our country. We don't want it to get too powerful up there, too much control. We'd like to leave a lot of that in the hands of the people, if at all possible. Recognizing that pure democracies, that's problematic too, because then it's mob rule. It's not that far from anarchy eventually. But you need it to do its thing. And if you have civil unrest, you'd like that to be taken care of. And if you're at war, you want a strong defense, right? And if people need help, you want someone there to be able to do it, right? Those things at the same time. And so there's kind of a tension going on, right? So I would agree with you. It's not an either or so much, it's a both and. We play both sides.
There's a habit that all the way of never arming anybody in the United States, never having a standing army or much of a standing army until the war breaks out. And
then you're playing catch up.
Then you're playing catch up.
Yeah.
And there's all the wars before World War II. I mean, they all were in that situation. And then after that, we've been pushed into the national state, international world. Anyway, we've been pushed out there where we were responsible for everything. And, are we... Well, we had a lot. We were
kind of the last man standing, and none of it was fought on our soil. So we were in a position to.
We were the last viable. We were the last power that hadn't had everything in their country bombed.
Right.
We had factories that weren't bombed, and
They
people that weren't bombed, and that was different.
Yeah. So where are we today? Do you think? Is our government strong or weak?
Well, I was in Quantico one time, and Antonin Scalia came and spoke to a big group of us. Right.
Was he already Supreme Court Justice at that time?
He was.
Yeah,
He'd been there a while. So it was just pretty interesting. We had a nice opportunity to get to listen to this man, right? But he gave a speech, and then he opened it up to questions, right? So one of the guys asked him a question about states' rights versus federal rights. Right? So
we're back to 1860, huh?
Well, yeah. I mean, it goes to that, but he.
Well, I mean, okay,
we've always wrestled with that, right? We've wrestled with that. until 1860, right? Well, what happened was he goes, why are you even asking me this question? He goes, I shuffle paper, right? I make decisions, right? But if you people out there are willing to go out and kill 500,000 people to get your way, who am I? You know, I'm nobody. You win. You know, you're the win. So basically, I think, according to what he said, we have a more stronger central power now than we used to have, than what it used to be.
Well, and I think that's true, right? I think that the federal government is risen in power to a large degree. Well, and we're still trying to figure that out,
It's the morality of the people that determine
how well it's going to work or not.
what you're gonna get, right? If
Right.
you have good morality, you have a better chance of being able to do more things on your own and without being controlled by somebody else. And that's.
And that probably addresses then the other question in
I
that
think
line.
We're even getting worse today, you know what I mean? It's spiraling in that direction even more.
So the less the people themselves are willing to commit themselves to leading a moral life, recognizing that at every era you're going to have, you know, we're imperfect and we're sinful, we're going to fail, but that at least the commitment to the concept is there. The less people will make that commitment, the more the government has to step in to try to keep everybody safe and things orderly, right? And so you're either going to need a stronger government, or but under any circumstances, it's not going to be what you might hope it would be. It gets harder to bear. It requires more resources of those in authority and a less stable society. The government can only do so. It can't do everything to keep the society stable, as is evidenced by the fact that from time to time they get overthrown by their own people. Right. So I read the quote. It's been attributed to a number of people. I think James Madison was the first. But after the Constitutional Convention comment, something to the effect that, you know, we've put together a form of government that is appropriate only for moral people who are willing to rule themselves by the Ten Commandments. The thing is, the more I've heard since I first heard that quote, the more it seems it might be apocryphal. They have trouble finding any place where you can actually specifically attribute it to one of the founding fathers. But whether you can attribute it or not, it seems to be a fairly reasonable statement, just on its own merits. Doesn't have to have the power of some really smart guy behind it to say that if people are not willing to live according to the Ten Commandments, you've got to. So, you know, people used to say, you can't legislate morality. Well, in fact, I think they still say that sometimes. And by morality, they usually are looking especially at things like sexual sins. But the fact is, every law that exists is an attempt to legislate morality. Which ones aren't? Right? And you shall not murder is morality. You shall not steal is morality. And so every law is an attempt to legislate morality. That being said, just having the law doesn't prevent crime from happening, right? It only gives us a reasonable basis for how to deal with it after the fact. It can serve as a deterrent to some degree, depending on the penal code you have set up with it. But, you know, it only goes so far. So these are the issues that they're dealing with in Isaiah's day. And we see that they have application to our time as well. Agree or disagree? The poor ought to be the concern of the government.
We're supposed to
Terry.
Disagree. Should be the concern of the church and the community.
Okay. Exclusively?
That'd be great.
But isn't the government to protect the weak from the strong?
It is.
Well, then they're the weak.
Well, okay, so I suppose the poor are the concern of the government, at the very least, in terms of their citizens. Yeah. And, you know, their protection is certainly. Now, whether solving poverty type issues as such is the concern of the government. So is the church's mission to solve poverty?
No.
Is the government's mission to solve poverty.
What if you said ameliorate instead of solve?
What if?
What's ameliorate?
Ameliorate, to lessen.
Make the less.
Make it less bad.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, make it not totally obliterated.
Yeah.
But just.
Well, is that the mission of the church?
I don't think that
To save souls.
you're not preaching that if it is.
Okay. All right, good answer.
Yeah, I mean,
Is it the mission of the government?
no, I mean clearly it's to protect and reduce,
Okay, so
provide order.
where do we put it?
It's on the individual. I mean, I would, when you say mission,
Yeah,
give me
okay.
something to write. I want to see my mission statement. Right, what do you want me to do? That's what I want. So the church is spreading the gospel pretty much, right? I mean, that's what we do. And then so the government setting an environment perhaps where people can live their life comfortably or whatever, safely. That's our mission. So it's up to us to whether or not we want to use it, however we want to use it.
So at least in terms of primary, I would say to some degree, I can find passages of scripture that assign part of it to both. So as I pointed out before, the law of Moses had a social safety net. Remember what Ruth did when she and Naomi came back from Moab to Bethlehem to support herself?
All of the workers in the field together, but
So she went into another man's private property and started picking the grain out of his field. How come Boaz didn't just have her thrown in jail for that? Stealing his grain.
because God made room for that years ago in the
All right.
in Genesis and Exodus.
So did she plant the grain? Did she cultivate the field? Did it belong to her? No, but part of God's, I guess maybe you would call, it was the original workfare program. But part of God's, the governing of Israel was that the poor had the right to glean the fields, and in fact, he kind of criminalized. I don't know that it says that there was a particular penalty that went along with it, but he kind of criminalized gleaning your own field. You go through and you harvest, but you don't pick over it again. That is to be left for those who don't have otherwise a means of support, so that they can go support themselves that way. It was kind of a tax, if you will, that was set up in Israel's government. And also one of the tithes. Now we probably think of the tithes more in line with the temple. And of course in the Old Testament you have to understand the church and government. So we in America talk about separation of church and state. That's not a biblical teaching. The Bible does teach a distinction between church and state, that they are two institutions God has established and each have their own mission. But the degree to which they're separate is free or open. And in the Old Testament, you had the theocracy. So they were together. So, but there was a tithe taken, and while it seems that would have been in line with what the temple work was, yet its distribution probably more on a government kind of level. And they would have, I don't know. I mean,
Now you're messing with our theology of giving. I mean, if King David, not to mention anybody, but I mean, if they were using it to build buildings and maintain weapons and their weaponry, then it's like it doesn't feel the same as if I'm.
It doesn't. But as late as the Reformation, Martin Luther said it would be good if less money flowed into the church to build these Gothic cathedrals that you go visit when you go to Europe, and more of it was just given to the poor.
He went to Rome and he was pissed. He was appalled.
Yeah. It was appalled. Not that Germany lacked some cathedrals and all, but he recognized. Now again, the cathedrals usually weren't just built by the church, but usually the local ruler had a big hand in it because he's probably going to have his plaques all over the wall about, King Harold the whatever, or King Edward the whatever, dedicated this window or, had this building put up. And a lot of times the local prince would see that cathedral that went up as a monument to himself in some ways. Didn't call it that, but anyway, he recognized that a lot of what went for support of other church programs could have maybe been better spent on the poor, and probably would have had a similar idea regarding what flowed in for the governments also. You know, he got himself, he recognized as a theologian he needed to pull back when you had the peasants' revolt in the early 1500s. And the peasants revolted in part because Luther criticized the rich people for not having good enough wages to take care of the peasants. And then when the peasants actually took up arms and revolted, then Luther said, well, we're not about disobedience to the government. And so he kind of gave the nobles permission to defend themselves. Well, then they didn't hold back. So they just slaughtered the peasants because they had all the weapons. And then, of course, when the peasants felt like Luther had turned on them, and Luther said, well, wait a minute. I am out of my depth here. This is about government. And I'll talk about church stuff. I can tell you what the Bible says about this or that, but you guys all have to have a willingness to love your neighbor and to try to work this out. You can't just on both sides just take up arms and slaughter each other over it.
Did the people in ancient Middle East have similar laws about helping the poor, or is there something distinctive about the biblical approach of the Israel, God's law to helping the poor versus other countries?
So the distinctive thing about so I'm sure they all had some kind of program.
Yeah.
Because, so you think of Joseph in Egypt.
Yeah.
Joseph, of course, is saving up all that grain, and it doesn't just go to feed the rich. It goes basically to anybody. Although he does kind of make all the land in Egypt belong to the Pharaoh, because eventually he's buying that up. So it wasn't for free.
Right.
But that being said, they understood you had to feed the population.
Yeah.
And I think there's generally been a sense of that. I think it's codified in the Bible in a way that I'm not aware. No, I'm not. I know the Bible. I do not know all of the, Law Code of Hammurabi. I'm not sure if anything like that falls into the Law Code of Hammurabi.
Yeah, that's a question.
Or others, and I'd have to do that research.
Just a question.
I'd be shooting from the hip on that. My guess is they probably had something. Historically, even non-Christian cultures, their governments have understood that while the king is often going to use his power to enrich himself, that's just the way that is. That he does stand in that position because the people are looking at him to take care of them to some degree, to defend them, and probably to whatever degree he can try not to make sure that they don't starve to death.
Yeah, and they had these grain houses, and they collected grain in big warehouses, and so you'd think there'd have to be some kind of tip. People, they'd have to pass it out in times of hunger and things.
So what happens with ancient Israel is that God connects this with morality, with love for your neighbor and keeping of his law. And I don't know that if the Greeks really thought Zeus cared much about this, or if the Romans thought that Jupiter cared much about this, so that with their, the gods concerned, or that affected your relationship with those gods. That would have been specific to the law of Moses. And the law of Moses would have made it much more an individual care and concern than you would have had just about any place else. I mean, that is the distinctive thing about the kind of the Old Testament faith compared to all it's monotheistic, and it is very centered on righteousness and love in a way that the others are more just about keeping peace, making people get along as well as possible. There's definitely a different spirit there.
I know Muslims do it, but yeah, you're right, it's different.
Yeah.
I've watched it. I've watched widows come into shops.
So
I hand out, money to them.
Yeah. So I can't remember what the term is, but they've got a term for essentially money collected. We would just call it charity, but they've got a term for that, and I think especially is it during Ramadan that they're supposed to take kind of the collection for that, and then also maybe personally be distributing some of that.
I think it's one of the pillars or something. Yeah, it's like Muslim.
The five pillars. Probably
the thing about helping the poor or something.
I think we talked through it well enough already. Should we as a church ban the use of makeup and jewelry?
The guys, no.
Some of the guys are kind of starting to nod their head a little bit.
I'm fine
No. Oh, okay. I thought you were starting to nod your
My
head.
joke's notwithstanding.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've heard some people, make comments about false advertising, but
Well, I've done that.
yeah,
That's a good joke.
yeah. But at the end of the day, as pretty as possible. Huh?
I was telling my wife and my sister-in-law that, how it's false advertising, and really you're just lying to us, is what you're doing.
And I bet they just gave you pass.
What happened is, they went to the store and they were looking at makeup, and the sister-in-law was, maybe you shouldn't do it, your husband will call you a liar. Yeah.
You just loved it.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
just loved it.
So, no. So, again, what God really values for all of us, right, is in the heart. And we all understand that the passage of time and the pull of gravity is going to have an effect on how we look, right? That's just how it goes. And the sooner that we get on board with that, probably the better. That doesn't mean we don't still try to make us look, men and women, as good as possible. But you have to recognize that that's where that heads aside. You'll get to heaven someday and it'll all be restored, and forever after everything will be great. But you have to recognize that that's just part of how it is. So the scriptures don't. While the scriptures comment on what makes a person truly beautiful, in contrast to what you can do with something you smear in your face or hang around your neck, it doesn't say it was wrong to smear that stuff on your face or hang that bauble around your neck. Right? So we should be careful not to go too far with that kind of thing.
Well, in the Old Testament, a lot of times when men wanted a woman to be their wife or someone's wife, like their sons, they would give them jewelry.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Not only that, but when you read any descriptions of weddings, when God uses the picture of a bride and a groom in the book of Isaiah, we'll get to it later, and he talks about like a bride adorned for her groom, or when you read the Song of Solomon, there is a whole lot of makeup, perfume, jewelry, and other things going on there as a part of the process, and it in no way comes under criticism. No way comes under criticism. Well, I think you recognize it. You can do what you can with cosmetics or cosmetic arts to gussy up a person as much as you want. Just a good spirit and a regular smile probably does more, right? If you perceive happiness there, and if there is just a smile, if it's not always pulled down in a frown or a scowl, nobody. We Americans get come under some criticism when we take pictures that we're always grinning. To the Europeans, we are weird that way. You always get that stupid grin on your face, right? And if you see them take selfies or pictures, you might think, what was wrong when you took this picture? Oh, how come you're all so sad?
Yeah, because they've always said since I was a kid, smile, say cheese, smile.
Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
So, but why? Because I think we recognize that that just it improves the attraction several points just all by itself, and it's free, and it's should be somewhat natural. Of course, God doesn't want just a smile pasted on your face because somebody said cheese, right? But what's in the heart? What's in the heart? And he sees that most of all. And God willing, more and more we can see into that. Okay, we'll pick it up at chapter 4. We got this chapter 3 knocked out then. Next time.